Welcome back to our discussion on connected government, sponsored by Microsoft on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. I'm your moderator, Francis Rose. My guests today are Dave Hebert of the U.S. Geological Survey, Susie Adams of Microsoft, and Andre Mendez, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and it is terrific to have all of you with me. We talked about collecting information through connectivity, and this, again, like a lot of the themes of our conversation today, applies to both internal and external customers. Dave, I want to start with you because my sense is that the way that you collect information through connectivity is primarily through internal customers, but is that the case?
Yes. As far as I'm aware, there's a lot more internal exchange of information. And I guess I would expand the concept of internal to be sort of across or pan-government.
Yes.
And that's a really important part of this connectivity concept that, a lot of the issues that government is trying to address, this sort of society's greatest challenges, can't be resolved through the org charts and hierarchies of federal agencies and the titles of people that sort of populate the top. They have to be addressed by sort of the best group of experts and the sort of minimal number of those experts needed to address a problem, and people who are willing to lead sometimes and to step back sometimes. So that exchange of information across agencies is very important to us and within the agency, and I think that's happening a lot more than input from outside of the government sphere, but it's still happening, and I think we talked about those policies and procedures. Very important to make sure we're consistent across the board in that exchange.
So, what's that exchange like in a federal government structure that is notorious for stovepipes and for very vertical information exchanges where horizontal information exchange is not nearly as easy?
It's funny. We probably, in a lot of ways, behave a lot better when we are interacting with citizens. I should have mentioned this before. This is a better answer to a question you asked me before, but another way that we're opening up data and finding that it's useful is through the concept of challenges, where agencies say, hey, public, we have an issue that we can't resolve, at least in an expedient and cheap manner. Mm-hmm. Here's $50,000 to anyone who can figure this problem out. Within the government sphere, again, I know I'm harping on this behavior and culture thing, but before you can ever get to what information and in what form would be best to share with these people, it's, well, whose logo is going to be first on the press release?
Right.
Whose title is most grand and important and impressive? Whose mission directive most closely aligns with this activity so that we can be in charge and tell everybody else what to do? I think we've got to get past that. If government is going to deliver its mission most effectively and most powerfully, it has to look at itself as sort of this amoebic body that can bring together actually a pretty impressive sort of spectrum of experts to deal with a problem. I think Deepwater Horizon, the oil spill, a few years ago was a great example. Our director at the USGS was part of the team responsible for figuring out how much oil was coming out of the ground and how are we going to stop it. Mm-hmm. And there were scientists, there were engineers, there were lawyers from BP, there were all kinds of people involved, and they did a great job of that ebb and flow of I'm leading now, I'm following now. And the guy who figured it out was not an executive. He was a scientist who used a groundwater model because it had, I think there were similar characteristics to the oil to figure out what was going on and how to stop it. He won a Service of America medal and was named Federal Employee of the Year. It wasn't about this person's title is above this person's title, so therefore they get the credit and they take the lead. I think government's got to start, and I think it is, looking at how it addresses issues that way.
Yeah. Andre, that's a classic problem. It's not a government problem. It's any kind of organizational structure. Anywhere there's an org chart, people are sensitive to Bigfoot in somebody that they don't want a Bigfoot. And I wonder if you're seeing that both at BBG and among your colleagues in government that you talk to, that not lack of sensitivity exactly, but the willingness to say it doesn't matter who gets the credit. This is an old leadership tactic. It doesn't matter who gets the credit as long as the job gets done.
Certainly, the type of spirit that we want to bring to the table. From a leadership standpoint, I think it's the only way to create a team that is fully functional and where you maximize the talents that you have working, in your environment. At the organizational level, there are a lot of other circumstances, for example, for the Broadcasting Board of Governors, that come into play as well. We are a part of public diplomacy, so we have to be very aware of the role that is being played in a particular situation by the State Department, by our interests in the region, despite the fact that we have a firewall in terms of the objectivity of the content that we deliver. And so, there is this constant interplay between allowing people as much range as possible, while at the same time working within a framework where there is not complete disruption that is introduced by a rogue agent. So that is something that always goes back and forth. But at the operational level, removing those barriers is absolutely essential to success, because otherwise you are limited by the individual at the top of the chain, and that's not always the best way to do business. And so from a leadership standpoint, it makes no sense to me to do business any other way.
And Susie, the topic of this conversation is connected government, not leadership principles in government. But it strikes me that so many of the things that we've talked about apply to the concept of connected government. They're standard issue things that leaders at all levels in all kinds of organizations think about that are not unique just to the idea of connected government. These are important principles that just happen to also apply in this area. Is that a fair way to put it?
I absolutely agree. If you look just at the culture of Microsoft, if you've been following Microsoft at all, really big announcements, and we now have this concept of one Microsoft. We've changed the way that people are reviewed to actually help that information sharing. And more importantly, I think if you look at just how people communicate, we used to be in a very asynchronous world that was just very tied by an email, and that email had an SLA of 24 to 40, usually 48 hours. You were okay if you responded within 48 hours, to more of a very synchronous world where it's all very real time, and where we're communicating, not just through what we consider, new technology in some spaces is unified communications. I think if you look at where we're going, right, the ability to get access real time to experts around the world, to be able to have them communicate in a matter of moments and actually see each other, so you can see the body language, how they're responding to those questions, right, is going to be key to changing kind of, just the pace at which communication grows. And for example, imagine a day where you could have a piece of plexiglass standing there, and it looks like the person you're communicating with that's halfway around the world is just on the other side of that. I mean, that's reality today. That technology exists, right? Getting it to the consumers is going to be kind of that next step. And I think when you start to realize that no longer is the day of sitting around a boardroom, right, having a conversation, meaning that you could actually read that person, you'll be able to be anywhere in the world, right, and do your job and get access to the people that can help you do that job more efficiently. And I think that's really the key to changing kind of the culture and where communication goes, both in the enterprise and in government, though, because I do think it applies to both.
Dave, you've talked about policy a couple of times throughout the course of our conversation. And I wonder if, when I think about the kinds of communication possibilities that Susie's talking about that exist, and I think about the rate of acceleration of technology, it strikes me that it would be very easy for the policy to get way behind the ability or the capacity of people to communicate, exchange information, and so on. Is that a risk, or is that potentially a benefit, that people can be creative without worrying about violating a policy because it doesn't exist yet? Or could it be both?
Yes. I know that's probably not the answer you want to hear, but I think it is both. And I think policies have to be written in order to further the mission, not to restrict people. But it is, I think it is, I don't write a lot of policy, but it seems that it is alluring to write policies specific to particular technologies and particular behaviors, when you could really be painting yourself into a corner in a very short period of time by doing that. So I think that the spirit of the policy needs to be, keeping in mind, are we making sure we're not breaking the law? Are we fulfilling our mission? Are we serving citizens? Those sort of high level philosophical goals, not micromanaging. I'm not really sure how the government is going to adapt policy-wise to that. I know Congress has struggled a lot with the internet and legislating the internet. I mean, it's the Wild West, and
right.
The law always seems to be a step behind. It's going to be very interesting to see if we can adapt legislation and policy to things that change on an hour-by-hour basis.
Andre, you were nodding your head very vigorously in agreement with Dave when I was asking him about risk or a benefit or both. What do you see when it comes to the idea of policy and how it applies to connectivity in the way you do it at BBG?
It is an ever-present situation. When you look at how communication has evolved throughout the centuries, right? The speed has continued to increase, right? The connectivity has continued to increase. As Susie mentioned, I mean, we are creating a stage where there's basically complete and total geographic abstraction. At the same time, so it doesn't matter where you are. You got all your data, you got access to everybody. I mean, you can wreak an enormous amount of damage, regardless of where you are on an instant basis on a Twitter feed, right? And so at the same time, you have all of these situations that have now gone to real time, from asynchronous to synchronous. So the ability to react on an immediate basis has that ability to both create very wonderful situations, including an enormous amount of stimulation between citizens that are now operating to a certain degree as a collective brain that bring value to the table, right? Crowdsourcing, for example, right? Content supplying from remote regions, right? But at the same time, you have all of the dangers associated with being able to manipulate large amounts of the population with one single source of information, because before it's verified, it is available to hundreds of millions of people. Yes, it is a huge problem, but it is a problem that is sort of has evolved throughout the centuries, right? The newspapers have done that. The telephone did that, where you could inform people instead of waiting for a cable to go across the Atlantic on a boat, right? So we're just dealing with a situation where the technology is constantly challenging the limits of both the human ability to adapt and the limits of the laws that govern it. And I don't know that there is an easy situation, right? But it is almost an evolutionary type of environment where what you will see is some evolutions away from the norm. And if they are positive, they will be adopted and become part of the substrate. And if they are not, hopefully they will be eliminated and fall apart in a very, Darwinian process. So, when I look at these types of risk-reward type of situations, nature has basically dictated how these things are going to happen. And you can try as much as you want to stay in front of that tsunami, but it has historically not been a successful endeavor.
And Susie, the way that Andre frames it, I take as a positive, because if I can paraphrase you, Andre, it sounds like what he's saying is, we figure this stuff out eventually. We find solutions eventually. He talks about the evolution through various types of technology. So maybe it would behoove us to take a step back and say, hey, we're going to figure all of this stuff out. No matter what technology becomes available, no matter what you and other companies throw at us, we're going to be able to manage it if we just kind of take a deep breath and think our way through it. Is that fair to say, do you think?
I kind of agree with Andre. I mean, if you look at cloud computing and just kind of the challenges the world, right, has met with the regulatory and compliance requirements, we had this notion that we could just store data anywhere. And it wouldn't really matter. We take advantage of the economies of scale, and everybody would be happy if they wouldn't care what country their data lived in. And what we've learned is data location, data access matter, and they're going to continue to matter until the regulatory and policies, right, on a worldwide basis catch up. And so I think it is a little bit Darwinian, and I think it is based on necessity and need. And if you look at just where we're going in the federal government with policy, right, we are not caught up with the current pace of change in IT with the policies. I mean, some of these policies are 15, 20 years old. In some instances, and don't apply at all to what we're trying to do now. That does cause a lot of cycles and a lot of cost to the American taxpayer. And I think that if we look at just the pressure now that's on the agencies to decrease the costs of running their data centers from a data center consolidation, now optimization perspective, right, the pressure there is going to force the change. And while we all wanted to, and try to force that change earlier, we didn't have a lot of success. And now there's the need. And the need is there, and I think we're going to see it happen much more quickly than we ever thought before, where people are going to be willing to change the policy because the benefit is just so enormous, right, to that policy change that it outweighs the risk. And we're already seeing that, right? And I use cloud because it is a great example of it with the adoption of cloud, whereas some folks would said, basically, I would never do that. I would never store my data in another data center. They're doing it now, and they're doing it because the price point is so compelling that they just can't afford not to. And I think that's what will help us with the policy challenges in the government today.
I want to thank you all for joining us for this terrific conversation on connected government. Andre Mendez of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, Susie Adams of Microsoft, and Dave Hebert of the U.S. Geological Survey. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for listening and watching our discussion on connected government, sponsored by Microsoft. I'm Francis Rose, Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Thanks for your time.